September 21st, 1944. Dawned with an eerie quiet over the Norman country. As sunlight broke through the heavy morning mist, the air hung thick with anticipation. Too still, too calm for what was coming. Off in the distance, the low thunder of engines began to roll across the hedgerows, growing louder with each passing second. But something about these approaching American tanks was different. The deep metallic growl didn't just signal another Allied advance. It carried the sound of change. Inside those M4 Shermans rumbled a secret, one that would soon rewrite the rules of armored warfare in ways no German commander could have foreseen. From his camouflaged position behind a battered stone farmhouse, Hauptmann Klaus Müller steadied his field glasses, his sharp eyes tracking the movement beyond the hedges. He had seen this picture many times before, columns of Sherman tanks pushing forward through the fog. The veteran panzer commander had destroyed dozens of them in recent months, and he expected today to be no different. To German forces, these tanks were little more than steel coffins. They even had a cruel nickname for them, Tommy Cookers or Ronsons, named after the cigarette lighter that lights every time. One well-placed shot and the American tanks went up in flames. Müller smirked, muttering to his gunner, Unterscharführer Hans Weber, "Same old Shermans. We'll brew them up like all the rest," but these Shermans weren't like all the rest. Hidden deep within their steel hulls lay an innovation that no German intelligence report had ever mentioned, a quiet revolution in tank design that would soon tip the balance of power. This was the dawn of a new kind of Sherman, one equipped with a system the Americans called wet stowage, a technological breakthrough that transformed a death trap into a weapon of survival. The tank at the head of the column belonged to Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. A seasoned commander, Harrison knew precisely what advantage his armored unit possessed. His Shermans had been outfitted with a new system surrounding their ammunition racks in sealed jackets filled with water, a modification born from months of study, testing, and the painful lessons of combat. These tanks had been trialed extensively at the Ardennes Proving Grounds in Maryland, but this would be the first time they faced real German guns. Classified reports from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department in 1944 showed staggering results. The wet stowage system reduced ammunition fires by more than 70% compared to earlier Sherman models. Yet the Germans had no idea. Their intelligence networks, so efficient in earlier years, had missed this entirely. They still believed American tanks were as vulnerable as ever, easy prey for the seasoned crews of the Wehrmacht's anti-tank batteries. The mist lifted as Harrison's column crept closer to the German lines. The world went from pale gray to violent color as the first muzzle flashes erupted from concealed German positions. The shriek of armor-piercing rounds tore through the air, hammering against the advancing tanks. In an instant, the battle was joined. Then came the first shock. A Sherman at the front of the formation took a direct hit from a German 75mm gun. Müller and his men waited for the familiar spectacle, the burst of flame, the roaring explosion that signaled another crew lost to the inferno. But instead, the tank merely rocked on its treads. It shuddered, then steadied and kept moving. Smoke, yes, but not fire. The crew inside, battered but alive, returned fire. Müller blinked, stunned. "Was ist das?" he hissed. The gunner fired again. Another hit. Still no explosion. One tank after another soaked up punishment that should have obliterated them. The German commander's unease deepened with every second. Something had changed, something fundamental. The answer to Müller's confusion lay not in the fields of Normandy, but thousands of miles away in Detroit, Michigan. January 15, 1944 marked a turning point in American tank design, though few at the time realized how historic it would become. Inside the massive Chrysler tank arsenal, engineers were waging a different kind of war. A war against fire itself. The so-called Sherman fire problem had become a nightmare for Allied forces. Reports from the North African and Italian campaigns painted a grim picture. Shermans that took a hit didn't just get knocked out, they burned violently and without mercy. Entire crews perished within seconds. The flaw came down to one deadly oversight in design. The Sherman's high explosive and armor-piercing shells were stored along the floor and sides of the tank, directly in the path of incoming fire. One lucky shot from a German 88, and the interior became a furnace. Dr. Richard Patterson, chief engineer of the Army Ordnance Department, spent countless hours buried in after-action reports and field data. What he read was horrifying. Tanks hit by enemy fire had an ammunition fire rate exceeding 60%, 4 times higher than that of the German panzers, which protected their shells far better. Patterson's team was ordered to find a solution, and fast. The breakthrough came from an unexpected mind. Marine Colonel David Chen, recently back from the Pacific Theater, had observed Japanese tanks captured on Pacific Islands. Some of them, he noted, stored ammunition surrounded by liquid cooling systems. Chen proposed a radical idea: surround the ammunition racks in American tanks with water jackets. Sealed chambers that would absorb heat and explosive energy before the shells could ignite. At first, it sounded absurd, but in desperation, the engineers tried it. At Aberdeen, Captain William Foster led the first live fire tests. German anti-tank guns captured in Tunisia were used to fire directly at Sherman hulls fitted with prototype wet stowage systems. The results astonished everyone present. Instead of catastrophic fireballs, the struck tanks merely hissed steam. Ammunition fires plummeted from 62% to just 18%. The data was undeniable. Lives could be saved, hundreds, maybe thousands. But there was a price. Implementing the system required a major overhaul of every Sherman production line. The water jackets added weight, reduced internal space, and slowed the tank's top speed. Manufacturers balked. Executives from General Motors and Chrysler argued that adding the modification would delay production at a time when every tank counted. The invasion of France was fast approaching, and delays could cost more lives than the fix could save. That's when Lieutenant General Leslie McNair made his stand. The commanding general of U.S. Army ground forces was not a man easily swayed by statistics alone, but he understood the human cost of those burning hulks littering Europe. McNair ordered that the new wet stowage system be implemented immediately in all new Sherman variants, regardless of production slowdowns. His reasoning was simple. A slower supply of tanks meant nothing if every crew inside them was doomed to die. By March 1944, the first wet stowage Shermans rolled off the production line. Their introduction was kept under tight wraps. Few even within the Army understood the system's significance. American High Command feared that if German intelligence discovered the change, they would adapt, altering their targeting strategies or designing new penetrator rounds. Thus, secrecy became as important as the technology itself. Even many American tank crews were unaware of the reason their newer tanks seemed to survive longer under fire. They noticed the difference, of course. The newer Shermans felt sturdier, safer, somehow less cursed than the earlier models, but no one told them why. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, roughly 40% of the Shermans landing on the beaches of Normandy were equipped with wet stowage systems. The rest were not. The result was a strange mix of fate and chance. 2 tanks side by side might take identical hits, and one would go up in flames while the other kept fighting. Some crews lived because of a secret they didn't even know existed. For the Germans, it was the beginning of confusion. For the Americans, it was the start of hope. Back in Normandy that September morning, as Müller's gunners reloaded and cursed their failing shots, The realization dawned that something had shifted in the balance of war. The familiar terror they once inspired, the certainty that their shells would light up the battlefield, was gone. Instead, the Shermans kept coming, crawling through smoke and debris, battered but unstoppable. The field commander's report that evening would be brief but telling. Enemy tanks no longer burn. What Muller couldn't see, buried beneath the steel plates of each Sherman, was the quiet hum of progress, the result of hundreds of engineers, sleepless nights, and hard lessons paid for in blood. In the industrial heart of America, they had built a miracle. October 3, 1944, the German war machine, though battered, still stood its ground across the smoldering fields of France. Inside the command headquarters of the 4th Panzer Army near Aachen, Oberst Friedrich von Manstein studied the latest battlefield reports under the dim yellow light of a desk lamp. He had seen thousands of such documents, engagement logs, damage summaries, ammunition counts, but these particular pages troubled him deeply. The numbers didn't make sense. His tank commanders were reporting something impossible. Sherman tanks, those same Tommy cookers that once erupted in fire at the mere kiss of an armor-piercing round, were surviving. They weren't just limping away, they were fighting back. Near Mortain, a single German Jagdpanzer had engaged 6 Shermans in a brutal firefight at close range. Von Manstein's eyes scanned the summary again. 6 direct hits. Only 2 of the American tanks had burned. The other 4, damaged, yes, but still operational. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Show me yesterday's engagement reports again," he ordered Major Hinrich Steiner, his intelligence officer. The papers spread across the oak table like a confession. Across the Western Front, German tank crews were reporting the same thing. Rounds that should have brewed up Shermans were now merely punching holes through armor, leaving the enemy shaken but alive. Steiner shifted uneasily. "Herr Oberst, our crews believe the Americans have modified their tanks, though we cannot determine how." Von Manstein frowned. That kind of change would have been noticed. German intelligence had prided itself on knowing every technical detail of Allied equipment. Yet nowhere was there mention of such an improvement. Something had slipped past them, and that realization was more frightening than any single battle lost. Meanwhile, in the American lines, the secret was holding strong. The wet stowage system remained one of the best-kept technological secrets of the war. Not a single captured Sherman had revealed it. The reason was simple. Few of the new variants had ever fallen into German hands intact. Those that were destroyed were burned beyond recognition. Those that survived were recovered by American maintenance crews before the enemy could inspect them. German engineers, still working off old intelligence, continued to analyze obsolete Sherman hulls, without water jackets, without the new internal redesigns, and therefore continued to fight the wrong war. Even Hauptmann Müller, the veteran panzer commander who had first encountered the immortal Shermans near Falaise, filed his report in frustration. "Enemy tanks absorb multiple direct hits without internal explosion. Recommend immediate technical evaluation of captured vehicles, but there were none to study. The battlefield offered only wreckage and rumors." By this point, Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, legendary father of the Panzer Arm, had returned to Berlin as Inspector General of the Panzertruppen. When von Manstein's report reached his desk, he read it twice, his expression unreadable. "Gentlemen," he told his staff during a strategy briefing, "we may be witnessing a fundamental shift in armored warfare." He tapped the report with his pen. "If the Americans have improved their tank survivability, then their numerical advantage will become decisive. We must adapt or die." But adaptation was a luxury Germany no longer had. The Wehrmacht's technical branches were overextended, their industrial base collapsing under relentless Allied bombing. Their best metallurgists and engineers were either dead, captured or redirected to wonder weapon projects that promised miracles but delivered little. The German army had the skill to understand what had changed, but not the time nor the opportunity to find out. By November 12th, 1944, the Americans were beginning to understand just how much of an edge they now possessed. At the headquarters of the Third Army near Metz, General George S. Patton, Jr. sat hunched over a stack of field reports with a cigar between his teeth. The news was unmistakable. Tank losses were plummeting. Ammunition fires, once the #1 killer of Sherman crews, had nearly disappeared. Patton's gravelly voice broke the silence. "By God," he muttered, "these new babies can take a hit." Colonel Bruce Clark of the 4th Armored Division stood nearby, a proud smile creeping across his face. "Sir," he said, "our boys are fighting different now. They're not afraid to get close. They trust their machines." It was true. Across the front, tank commanders were changing the way they fought. Before, they had hung back at long range, keeping distance between themselves and the dreaded 88mm guns. Now they pushed forward, using mobility, numbers, and newfound confidence to overwhelm German defenses. In military terms, this wasn't just an improvement, it was a revolution. Major Robert Williams of the 2nd Armored Division had seen it firsthand. His company had been nearly wiped out during the summer battles in Normandy, losing crew after crew to catastrophic ammunition explosions. But by autumn, his new Shermans were surviving encounters that would have been certain death just months before. "The difference," Williams told war correspondent Ernie Pyle, "is night and day. My boys know they've got a fighting chance now, even if Jerry lands one through the armor. That knowledge changes everything." Pyle's article, printed across America, praised the courage of U.S. tankers without revealing the secret that kept them alive. The public saw bravery, the army saw engineering. As American forces advanced through the forests and towns of France, their armored tactics evolved almost overnight. The wet stowage Shermans allowed for tighter formations, coordinated rushes, and closer support for infantry. Commanders could risk bold maneuvers that would have been suicide just months before. Tankers no longer abandoned vehicles at the first sign of smoke. They stayed and fought. Even damaged, a Sherman could still move, shoot, and survive. The effects rippled through the ranks. Crew morale soared. Veterans who once faced each day with dread now entered battle with determination. Their survival wasn't a matter of luck anymore. It was science, hidden beneath steel and water. But in war, every innovation invites its ultimate test. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes. The Germans called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. History would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. The snow came early that year, blanketing the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg in silence. Under cover of darkness, the German army unleashed its last great offensive. Thousands of men and hundreds of tanks poured through the Ardennes, catching the Allies off guard. It was Hitler's final gamble, to split the Allied front and force a negotiated peace. In the village of Bastogne, Captain Samuel Rodriguez commanded a company of M4A3E8 Shermans, the newest of the new. His tanks carried not only the wet stowage system, but also an improved suspension and thicker frontal armor. To the untrained eye, they looked like the same old Shermans, but to those inside, they were something else entirely. At dawn, the fog was so thick that visibility barely stretched 50 yards. Then came the sound, a low, growing thunder as German Panthers and Tiger IIs rolled forward through the tree. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Rodriguez's men braced for impact. The first volley of German 88mm rounds screamed through the fog, slamming into the American line. One tank erupted in flame, an older Sherman without wet stowage, but the others held. Armor-piercing shells punched through, but no fires followed. Crews stayed in their vehicles, returning fire with cold precision. "Keep firing!" Rodriguez shouted over the radio, his voice drowned in static and gunfire. Across the line, German gunners like Unterscharführer Hans Weber, the same man who once served under Müller, watched in disbelief. He had seen American tanks burn like paper all through France, but now something was wrong. "Our rounds are hitting," he reported to his commander, "but they're not burning like before." The fighting around Bastogne became some of the most desperate of the war. Waves of German armor crashed against the American perimeter, only to be repelled again and again. The wet stowage system wasn't just saving lives, it was buying time. Crews that would have died in minutes fought for hours. A handful of surviving Shermans held crossroads and ridges long enough for reinforcements to arrive. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne Division, took note of what he was witnessing. "Our tank units are lasting longer," he wrote in his situation report. "They're holding positions I would have thought impossible." And indeed they were. The secret inside those tanks, the quiet hum of water cooling the deadly heat of war, was helping to decide the fate of Europe. By the time the snow melted and the guns fell silent in January 1945, the German offensive was broken. The Wehrmacht had thrown its last reserves into the fire and lost. American losses were high, but without the new wet stowage systems, they would have been catastrophic. The technology had passed its final trial by fire, literally. While tank crews celebrated survival far behind the front, German intelligence officers were still struggling to make sense of what had happened. None of their data matched reality. Fewer than 20% of hit Shermans now burned, down from 60% earlier in the war. It was a change so drastic that some analysts suggested the Americans had started using new armor alloys or secret fire-retardant chemicals. But no one suspected the truth, a simple solution hidden in plain sight involving little more than water and ingenuity. At a commandeered schoolhouse near Cologne, Colonel Max Weber of German military intelligence pored over reconnaissance photos and field reports late into the night. The man, unrelated to gunner Hans Weber, had one task: to find out why American tanks refused to die. "Bring me every photograph of destroyed Shermans from the past 3 months," he ordered his aide. The results baffled him. The numbers didn't lie. Penetrations were occurring, but explosions were not. Something fundamental had changed. Before the war, German intelligence had been unmatched. Their engineers could disassemble and analyze captured weapons within days. But by 1945, years of attrition had hollowed out that capability. The Reich's technical specialists were dead, drafted, or working on secret weapons projects that had little impact on the front. Weber's team of overworked analysts simply didn't have the resources or the access to discover the truth. Even when intact Sherman hulls were captured, they were often old variants, lacking the crucial wet stowage feature. The Germans drew the wrong conclusions and continued to fight under false assumptions. One by one, their tactical advantages slipped away. Back at the front, those assumptions cost lives. Captain Ernst Hoffmann, commanding a Jagdpanzer unit, sent in a frustrated report. "The Americans have changed something important," he wrote. "We need new tactics immediately." But none would come. Without understanding the innovation, the Germans could not adapt to it. They fought as they always had, expecting fire, finding none. As the war dragged toward its end, even propaganda began to falter. The Reich had long shown triumphant footage of burning Sherman tanks to bolster morale, proof of supposed German superiority, but now those images were harder to find. Fewer fires meant fewer symbols of victory. Even civilians began to sense that the tide was turning. March 22, 1945, the Rhine crossing. The final drive into Germany had begun. General Omar Bradley watched as his armored divisions rolled across pontoon bridges toward the shattered towns on the far bank. For the first time in the war, American commanders didn't have to fear the sight of burning tanks littering the battlefield. Their losses were steady, predictable, sustainable. The wet stowage system had given the Allies something priceless: momentum. Hauptmann Müller, the same commander who had once watched his shells bounce uselessly off advancing Shermans in Normandy, now found himself leading a makeshift defense force of Hitler Youth and old men near Frankfurt. His once proud panzer unit was gone, ground to dust. He stared at the horizon as more Shermans approached. "We're fighting yesterday's war against tomorrow's enemy," he murmured. He was right. American tankers, seasoned now by months of hard fighting, had become masters of their craft. Men like Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, who had survived 3 direct hits during the Bulge, pushed forward through Germany's ruined streets with the calm of veterans who trusted both God and steel. "This old girl's taken everything Jerry can throw at her," O'Brien told a Stars and Stripes reporter as he patted the side of his scarred but unbroken Sherman. The war was nearly over, and the tanks that had once been symbols of Allied vulnerability were now the instruments of their triumph. April 1945. Germany was dying, but it refused to die quietly. The skies over the Ruhr Valley were thick with the smell of burning fuel and twisted metal. Allied bombers had reduced once proud cities to ash and rubble, yet pockets of resistance still clung to life. Between the shattered buildings and cratered roads, Sherman tanks crept forward in cautious silence, their treads grinding over debris that once formed homes, schools, entire lives. In one of those tanks sat Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, the veteran who had survived 3 direct hits during the Battle of the Bulge. His hands, though steady, bore the tremor of exhaustion that months of combat could not hide. Across from him sat Private First Class Louis Tex Hanley, barely 19, clutching his helmet with nervous fingers. They'd heard the rumors the war was almost over, but rumors didn't stop bullets. "Feels different now," Hanley muttered, staring out the periscope. "Every fight could be the last." O'Brien gave a dry laugh. "You said that back in France, kid. You're still here." But deep down, even he could feel it. The strange weight of history pressing down. The roads were open now. The once invincible Wehrmacht was retreating in chaos, its tanks left smoldering or abandoned. And still, the Shermans kept advancing. What few German tanks remained were outnumbered and outgunned. The mighty Tiger IIs, once the terror of Allied crews, now sat silent, stranded without fuel. And when they did fight, they no longer held the same terror. The wet stowage Shermans had taken away that one psychological edge the Germans had always possessed: the fear of instant death by fire. In a final desperate counterattack outside Kassel, a small group of German panzers under the command of Oberleutnant Ernst Hoffmann ambushed an American column. It was textbook panzer warfare: hit fast, strike hard, and disappear. But the old formula no longer worked. The American tanks didn't panic, didn't scatter. They took the hits, absorbed the punishment, and pressed forward with relentless calm. Hoffmann watched through his binoculars as 2 of his 88mm rounds struck home. The first Sherman shuddered but kept moving. The second erupted in smoke but refused to burn. Through the haze, the tank's turret rotated, its gun zeroing in on his position. "They don't die anymore," Hoffmann whispered, almost in disbelief. When the counterattack failed, Hoffmann was captured. Days later, in an interrogation camp near Remagen, he told his American captors, "You must have found a way to keep your tanks from exploding. My men thought you were using some sort of fire-resistant fuel." His interrogator, a weary army major, only smiled and replied, "Something like that." By then, the secret was no longer a secret. With Germany's defeat inevitable, American engineers began sharing details of their wartime innovations with Allied partners. British tank designers, who had faced the same fiery horrors with their own Cromwells and Churchills, were particularly eager to learn how the Americans had managed to reduce catastrophic fires so dramatically. In a technical report dated April 29, 1945, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department formally documented the success of the wet stowage system. The numbers spoke volumes. Ammunition fires in Shermans built before 1944. 60% of all penetrations. Ammunition fires in Shermans with wet stowage. 15 to 18%. That single change had cut fatality rates by more than half and improved combat endurance beyond anything the Allies had previously achieved. To the average soldier, these numbers meant survival. To military engineers, it was revelation. Even as the war in Europe neared its bloody conclusion, the lessons of the wet stowage system were already being written into the future of armored design. The British began experimenting with insulated ammunition racks. The Soviets, who learned quickly from any advantage, studied captured Shermans sent through Lend-Lease and applied similar cooling principles to post-war tanks like the T-54. In every major army across the world, the message was clear. Armor wasn't enough. True survivability depended on what happened inside the tank after a hit. But back in Europe, the human cost was still being counted. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Allied occupation forces began cataloging German technology, equipment, and research. Among the many discoveries, V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, and guided bombs, one of the most surprising revelations came from German tank crews themselves. Captured reports revealed just how thoroughly the wet stowage system had confounded the Reich's military intelligence. Many German commanders had believed that American crews were injecting special chemicals into their fuel tanks to prevent explosions. Others thought the Americans had developed a new type of self-sealing armor. No one had guessed the truth, that the secret was nothing more than water, steel, and American ingenuity. At a POW camp near Nuremberg, Oberst Friedrich von Manstein, who had once raised the alarm about unburnable Shermans, was finally told the truth by an American colonel. "Water jackets," the colonel said simply. "That's it." Von Manstein stared at him, incredulous. "Water?" he repeated. "You beat us with water?" The colonel nodded. "Water and time." For a moment, the old German officer said nothing. Then, with a faint smile of bitter admiration, he replied, "We were trying to build miracles." "You were building solutions." That statement, later recorded in an army interview, would become one of the most quoted lines in post-war analysis. Historians cited it as a perfect summary of the difference between the two war machines, the German pursuit of technological perfection versus the American mastery of practicality. In Detroit, where the Chrysler tank arsenal once churned out thousands of M4 Shermans a month, the war effort ended almost overnight. The plant that had roared day and night for years now fell silent. But the engineers who had pioneered the wet stowage system didn't stop working. Many were reassigned to the next generation of American tanks, the M26 Pershing and later the M46 Patton. In those designs, the lessons of the Sherman lived on. The Pershing's ammunition storage incorporated insulated racks, automatic fire extinguishers, and compartmentalized hull sections to prevent secondary explosions. What began as an emergency wartime innovation became a standard for all future tank design, a legacy forged in the crucible of Normandy and the frozen forests of Belgium. Meanwhile, for the men who had fought inside those steel beasts, the memories of survival lingered long after the victory parades faded. Staff Sergeant O'Brien returned home to New Jersey in the summer of 1945. He married his sweetheart, bought a modest house, and raised 2 sons. For years, he refused to talk about the war. But one night, decades later, sitting on his porch with his grandson, he finally told the story of the day his tank survived an 88mm shell. "I remember the hit," he said quietly. "Sounded like a giant hammer smashing the world, thought we were done for. But when the smoke cleared, we were still there, still breathing. Didn't make sense back then. Now I know it was that water system they put in." His grandson, barely 12, looked up in awe. "So they saved you with water?" O'Brien smiled faintly. "Yeah, saved a lot of us. In 1947, the U.S. Army published a classified internal study titled Evaluation of Crew Survivability Improvements in M4 Series Tanks. The report concluded that the wet stowage system had altered the psychological dynamic of armored warfare. In plain English, it meant that soldiers fought differently when they believed they could live. Confidence, it turned out, was as powerful a weapon as any cannon. Even in the years that followed, veterans continued to credit the innovation with saving lives. Tank crews from the 2nd Armored Division, the 3rd Army, and the Canadian 5th Armored spoke of battles they should not have survived, and yet did. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground, engineers preserved one of the earliest prototype Shermans fitted with the original wet stowage system. Today, that tank sits in a museum, its unassuming water jackets still intact, a silent monument to thousands of lives spared by an idea born out of necessity and desperation. For the Germans, the post-war years brought reflection and a bitter understanding of how close they had come to discovering the same principle. In a 1946 debriefing, former Panzer engineer Otto Behrens revealed that his team had considered adding liquid cooling insulation to ammunition storage in the Panther II project. But by late 1944, resources were gone, factories were bombed, and time had run out. "We knew the problem," he said. "We just never had the chance to solve it." Across Europe, the burned-out hulks of tanks from both sides still littered the countryside. Yet among the wreckage, one pattern stood out. The Shermans built after 1944, the ones with wet stowage, were often found intact, their interiors blackened but not consumed by fire. It was a small but haunting difference, a physical reminder that innovation could change the very shape of death. By the 1950s, military historians began calling the wet stowage upgrade the invisible armor. It didn't make the Sherman faster, stronger, or more powerful, but it made it survivable. And in war, survival is everything. At the height of the Cold War, when the US and Soviet Union began designing massive new tanks like the M60 and the T-62, the lessons from that small American invention still echoed. Engineers spoke not of thicker armor alone, but of energy absorption, compartmentalization, and internal suppression systems, all concepts rooted in that humble wartime fix from 1944. Even NASA, during the design of its early spacecraft, cited the Army's wet stowage principles in studies on explosion prevention and compartment safety. What began as a battlefield innovation to save tank crews had become a building block of modern engineering. Yet for all its legacy, the story of the wet stowage system was nearly forgotten in the public memory. It was overshadowed by the grand narratives, the Normandy landings, the Battle of the Bulge, the atomic bomb. But among the men who had lived through it, the truth remained clear. When asked in a 1979 interview what he thought truly turned the tide of armored combat in Europe, retired General Bruce Clark didn't mention air superiority or numbers. He simply said, "We stopped burning." That phrase, simple and chilling, summed up the quiet revolution that changed everything. Today, historians looking back on the Second World War see the wet stowage system as a symbol of how victory is often built not on grand strategy or superweapons, but on the unseen, uncelebrated details, the tiny miracles of human thought that turn fear into endurance. In the grand sweep of history, it wasn't the roar of engines or the flash of cannons that made the difference. It was a handful of engineers who refused to accept that death by fire was inevitable. It was a general who believed slower production was worth more lives saved. It was crews who trusted their machines enough to keep fighting when every instinct said to run. And somewhere in that chain of decisions, between logic, courage, and invention, the outcome of a world war was quietly rewritten. For the men who rode into battle inside those tanks, it was more than technology. It was hope made metal. The guns had gone quiet, but the echoes of war never truly fade. It was now 1951, 6 years after the last Sherman rolled through the rubble of Berlin, and once again tanks moved across foreign soil. This time, the battlefields were not in Europe, but in the jagged hills and frozen valleys of Korea. The world had changed, the armies had changed, but the lessons learned in 1944 had not. In the Korean peninsula, American M26 Pershings and the newer M46 Pattons faced off against Soviet-made T-34s in brutal armored duels that unfolded across the peninsula. It was the first true test of post-war tank design for engineers back in the United States. This was the proving ground for everything they had learned from the Sherman's transformation. Inside those newer tanks, ammunition was now stored in insulated compartments protected by fire suppression systems that activated instantly upon penetration. The core idea, the legacy of wet stowage, was alive in every bolt and weld. Captain Robert "Red" Merrick, commanding a platoon of Pattons near the Han River, recalled how his tank took a direct hit from a T-34 shell. "We felt the impact like a hammer," he said later in an after-action report. "For a second I thought we were done for." But no fire. The extinguishers kicked in before the heat spread. "We kept fighting." Merrick survived that engagement and later told a military journalist, "Those engineers back in '44 saved our hides again. We're still living off the lessons they learned." That statement wasn't hyperbole. It was truth. The lineage of survival innovation that began in the mud of Normandy had become a design philosophy. American engineers realized something profound during World War II. A tank's purpose wasn't only to destroy, it was to keep its crew alive long enough to win. At the Detroit Arsenal, where the next generation of tanks was being designed, engineers studied the aftermath of every Korean engagement. They noted patterns, the survivability rates, the ignition thresholds, the internal layout of the tanks. The data reinforced what the old Sherman engineers already knew. Most tanks weren't lost because of penetration alone, but because of what happened after the shell went in. That realization forever altered how tanks were built. In later decades, this principle evolved into what military scientists began calling compartmentalized survivability. The M60 series in the 1960s and later the M1 Abrams in the 1980s carried this DNA forward. Their ammunition was sealed off from the crew behind blast-proof doors. If a shell penetrated the armor, the force of the explosion vented upward, away from the men inside. In essence, it was a direct descendant of that same thinking, a modern echo of water-filled racks designed to keep fire from spreading. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, Soviet designers were wrestling with similar questions. The T-55, T-62, and T-72 series all incorporated partial blast suppression systems and heat-resistant storage. Even nations that had once fought against America now quietly borrowed from the innovation born out of Chrysler's wartime desperation. Survival, after all, was a universal language. But the influence of the wet stowage system didn't stop with tanks. Its philosophy rippled outward, shaping how engineers approached every machine where heat, fire, and containment could mean the difference between life and death. It informed jet aircraft design, naval engineering, and even space exploration. When NASA developed the Apollo command module, They cited the Army's research on fluid suppression and containment systems from the 1940s as an early conceptual influence. The quiet legacy of the Sherman lived on in places no one could have imagined. For the men who built it, the war had ended, but their work became the foundation of something much larger, a blueprint for survival that outlasted the battlefield. In 1953, Dr. Richard Patterson, the chief engineer of the Army Ordnance Department who had overseen the original wet stowage project, received a small letter from a soldier who had served in Normandy. The handwriting was rough, the ink faded, but the words were clear. "Sir, I don't know your name, but I heard you were one of the men who fixed our tanks. I just wanted to say thank you. Because of what you did, I got to come home." That letter hung framed in Patterson's office until the day he died. The true measure of war's innovation isn't just the machines it produces, it's the lives it saves. Every generation of engineers who came after Patterson carried that torch. They saw in those early wartime improvisations a moral obligation. If you can make a machine safer, you must. It's a philosophy that guided not just the military but the entire post-war industrial world. Automobiles gained better fuel containment, aircraft incorporated redundant fire suppression systems, and even buildings were designed with more robust safety codes, all tracing faint lines back to a battlefield solution involving water and steel. By the time the Vietnam War broke out, the M48 and M60 tanks were virtually immune to the kind of catastrophic ammunition fires that had once plagued the Sherman. Their armor was thicker, their ammunition isolated, and their internal layouts designed to buy precious seconds for escape. Survival had become science. In 1985, the U.S. Army published a retrospective report titled 50 Years of Armored Survivability. Lessons from the M4 Sherman to the M1 Abrams. The opening paragraph read, "The progress of armored warfare has been measured not merely by the destruction of enemy forces but by the preservation of our own." The invention of the wet stowage system in 1944 marked the birth of modern survivability design, proof that courage and engineering can coexist in steel. The words struck a chord with every veteran who had ever crawled out of a tank alive. Even now, in the 21st century, the descendants of those Shermans still rumble across training fields. Museums preserve them, restorers rebuild them, and historians study them. Yet it's not their firepower or speed that inspires awe. It's their resilience. Standing beside one of those weathered tanks today, you can almost hear the heartbeat of the men who rode within them, trusting their lives to something as simple as a layer of water between shells and steel. When visitors at the Aberdeen Proving Ground walk past the preserved wet stowage Sherman, the placard beside it reads, "This tank represents a silent victory, one not won by generals but by engineers," and it's true. The war had been filled with grand gestures, D-Day, the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, but the real turning points often happened in workshops and laboratories far from the front. There, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of oil and iron, anonymous minds quietly reshaped the future. In 1994, marking the 50th anniversary of the system's introduction, the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum held a small ceremony. Few attended, and even fewer understood its significance. Among the attendees were two elderly veterans, Michael O'Brien and Lewis Hanley. They stood together in front of a restored M4A3 Sherman, the same model they had fought in half a century earlier. O'Brien placed his hand on the cold steel. "You know," he said to Hanley, "people talk about bravery, heroism, luck. But this right here," he patted the side of the turret, "this is what gave us a chance." Hanley nodded slowly. "Funny," he said, How something nobody ever talks about ended up saving so many lives. A few minutes later, the museum curator approached and asked O'Brien if he wanted to say a few words for the record. The old sergeant thought for a long moment before replying. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice gravelly but steady. "Tell him we weren't just fighting the enemy out there. We were fighting our own fear. Every man who climbed into one of these knew what could happen if we took a hit, but one day we started taking hits and walking away. That changed everything. That's when we knew we could win." Those words were recorded, archived, and played decades later in documentaries and classrooms. They served as a reminder that history's greatest triumphs are not always loud. They are sometimes quiet revolutions of thought, courage, and compassion. When historians write of the Second World War, they often focus on the vast battles and the towering figures who led them. But somewhere between those grand stories lies the smaller truth. Victory depends as much on the unseen as the seen. It depends on the mechanic tightening a bolt, the draftsman redrawing a plan, the engineer refusing to accept that burning alive was just part of war. The wet stowage system was not glamorous. It didn't make the Sherman invincible or elegant, but it made it survivable, and that made all the difference. Today, the lessons it taught continue to ripple across generations. In every cockpit where a pilot trusts a containment system, in every armored vehicle designed to vent explosions upward instead of inward, in every emergency crew that trains to contain rather than react, the spirit of that 1944 innovation lives on. The tanks of World War II may be relics now, but their legacy is eternal. Proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, our greatest weapon has never been destruction. It has always been creation, the courage to build something that preserves life rather than takes it. In the end, that is what defines civilization's progress. Not the wars we win, but the lives we save.